Let the galaxy burn. These words, spoken by War Master Horus before he turned half the Space Marine legions against the Emperor, ignited the most devastating civil war in human history. The Imperium has never fully recovered from this betrayal, even 10,000 years later. All 18 legions once fought together, conquering the stars for humanity. Each possessed its own personality and combat doctrine. The savage world eaters, the scholarly Thousand Sons, and many more. We're examining every legion, their origins, their primarchs, and the crucial decisions that determine their loyalties. What terrible secrets did these superhuman warriors harbor? And what pushed some of the Emperor's finest creations to betray everything they stood for? The Emperor's grand design, creation of the legions. What if I told you the Emperor never intended for his Space Marines to be heroes, but weapons? Cold, engineered tools of war meant to fulfill a singular purpose: conquest. After the age of strife had fractured humanity across the galaxy, the Emperor needed something more than regular soldiers. He needed living weapons that could bring worlds to heal. The creation of the Space Marine legions happened during the final blood-soaked days of the Unification Wars on Terra. The Emperor had already conquered most of the homeworld using his earlier creations, the Thunder Warriors. But those Proto-Astartes were flawed, unstable. Their bodies and minds began to break down after battles, like early smartphone prototypes that overheat and crash after intensive use. They served their purpose in unifying Terra, but couldn't sustain the long campaign among the stars. So, the Thunder Warriors mysteriously died out after the Battle of Mount Arreat. And by died out, I mean they were systematically purged by the Emperor's forces once they outlived their usefulness. Yeah, not exactly the behavior of a benevolent ruler, right? This should have been the first red flag about how the Emperor viewed his transhuman creations. The Space Marine legions that replaced them were more stable, more controllable, and designed specifically for different warfare scenarios. Each legion's gene seed was derived from one of 20 primarchs, the Emperor's superhuman sons maturing in secret laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. Their origins as mysterious as they were revolutionary. In those early days, there was no pageantry, no mythic identities. The legions wore simple, unadorned gray armor. They were known only by numerical designations: the 1st Legion, the 6th Legion, the 17th Legion. Each one programmed with specific combat doctrines and psychological imprints that would later align with the Primarch's personalities. Personalities the Emperor himself had engineered. The Emperor's secrecy regarding the Primarchs planted seeds for future disaster. He never explained to anyone, not even Malcador the Sigillite, the complete truth about how and why he created these demigods. What dangerous knowledge had he used to create beings of such immense power? What compromises has he made in their creation? These legions believed they were the Emperor's chosen sons, destined for glory. In reality, they were conquest tools with planned obsolescence. Once the galaxy was conquered and brought to compliance, what need would there be for armies of superhuman warriors? When the Great Crusade began and the Primarchs were discovered across the galaxy, each legion adopted its Primarch's character. They developed identities, cultures, and Brotherhood bonds the Emperor never intended. The Dark Angels became a knightly order under Lion L. Johnson. The Warhounds transformed into the Savage World Eaters under Angron. This transformation from numbers to names, from weapons to warriors with identities, was perhaps the most human thing about these transhuman soldiers. They wanted purpose beyond killing. They wanted meaning, brotherhood, legacy. But the Emperor had designed them for war, not peace, for conquest, not governance. The Loyal Nine, Brotherhood forged in battle. The Dark Angels harbor a secret that rivals the betrayal of the fallen legions themselves, like a festering wound beneath polished armor. Half of the 1st Legion turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, Yet they've maintained a facade of perfect loyalty for 10 millennia. This isn't some minor footnote in Imperial history. It's a catastrophe that nearly matched the damage done by the openly rebellious legions. The secret shame of Leon L. Johnson's sons continues to haunt them, even 10,000 years after the events on their homeworld, Caliban. The loyal legions each carried burdens that could have broken lesser warriors. The Space Wolves, under Leman Russ, served as the Emperor's executioners, reportedly destroying their own brother legions when commanded. Meanwhile, Salamanders paid for their loyalty in blood at the drop site massacre on Istvan V, walking into what they believed was a battle alongside allies, only to face near annihilation. Like a fortress with burning walls still refusing to surrender, these legions remained steadfast despite betrayal and decimation. The Ultramarines stood as titans among their peers, commanding approximately 250,000 Astartes at their peak, a force so vast it could overwhelm entire star systems in methodical conquest, turning worlds compliant through sheer, overwhelming presence. Their immense numbers later allowed Guilliman to fundamentally reshape Astartes' organization through the Codex Astartes, forever changing how Space Marines would operate across the galaxy. The Imperial Fists, masters of defensive warfare, marshaled around 100,000 warriors at their height. While Glory Seekers conquered new worlds, Dorn's sons perfected the art of holding ground, expertise that became the Imperium's salvation during the Siege of Terra. Ferrus Manus commanded over 113,000 Iron Hands before the Heresy erupted. Their bitter rivalry with the Emperor's children ended in tragedy when Ferrus was beheaded by Fulgrim, leaving his legion leaderless but unbroken in their loyalty. The Blood Angels, approximately 120,000 strong under Sanguinius, maintained their nobility despite harboring a terrible flaw in their gene seed. Their Primarch sacrificed himself facing Horus, yet his sons continued serving the Imperium even as the Blood Rage threatened to consume them. Corvus Corax led roughly 80,000 Raven Guard Astartes, suffering catastrophic losses at Istvan V. Reduced to a shadow of their former strength, they fought on using guerrilla tactics against overwhelming odds rather than yielding to despair. What makes these 9 legions truly heroic is that each faced pressures and challenges that could easily have pushed them toward heresy. The very same forces that corrupted their fallen brothers. They endured identical slights, disappointments, and confusion about the Emperor's grand design. The Ultramarines lost their conquered worlds to bureaucrats. The Iron Hands watched their Primarch die horribly. The Blood Angels battled a gene curse that drove them to madness. Yet where others fell to darkness, these legions stood firm in the light. The Fallen 9, from heroes to heretics. But what about the 9 who broke? When the World Bearers watched their perfect city of Monarchia burn under the Emperor's orders, not by enemy action but by their own father's command, something fundamentally changed in the Legion's DNA. This wasn't a military rebuke. It was a soul-crushing betrayal that left psychic scars deeper than any physical wound. Each traitor legion's fall followed a pattern. The Emperor created them for specific purposes, then condemned them for fulfilling those same purposes. Lorgar's legion spread worship of the Emperor only to be punished for their devotion. His haunting words reveal their broken faith. Alone, a legionary is a formidable foe as far beyond a man as the wolf is beyond the sheep. Together, bound by ties of unshakable loyalty, a legion is a force that can extinguish the stars and shake the very heavens. Bitter irony, these words about loyalty came from the first Primarch to embrace the Chaos Gods. The Iron Warriors suffered under Perturabo, regulated to grinding siege warfare while their brothers claimed glory. The Emperor's finest engineers became expendable tools, building fortresses only to destroy others elsewhere. Their casualties mounting without recognition or honor. When the rebellion came, they unleashed their siege expertise against the Imperium with the precision and fury of those who had endured decades of thankless sacrifice. The Night Lords faced similar hypocrisy. Created as weapons of terror by the Emperor himself, Conrad Cruz and his legion were later condemned for fulfilling exactly that purpose. What loyalty does a son owe to a father who despises him for being exactly what he was made to be? Became their unspoken creed as they turned their terror tactics against their creator. Perhaps most tragic was 1,000 Suns. Magnus and his legion used psychic powers that mirrored the Emperor's own abilities, yet were condemned for it. When they desperately tried warning the Emperor about Horus's betrayal, they were accused of sorcery. Their reward for trying to save the Imperium? The Emperor dispatched the Space Wolves to burn their world to ashes. The remaining traitor legions followed similar paths. The Death Guard, proud of their resilience, broke when subjected to biological horrors beyond even their tolerance. The Alpha Legion may have turned traitor to ultimately save the galaxy, according to some accounts. The Emperor's children fell through pride when perfection proved impossible. The pattern becomes clear. The Emperor's own flaws planted the seeds for the heresy. His secrecy about the warp left his sons vulnerable to its corruption. His hypocrisy in condemning psychic powers while being humanity's greatest psyker created deep resentment. His emotional distance prevented him from seeing the warning signs until it was too late. He designed sons who needed a father but gave them only a distant creator who saw them as tools. Chaos didn't have to work hard to turn half the legions. The Emperor had already created deep wounds in his sons' psyches. Chaos merely poured salt in those wounds and offered alternatives to those who felt abandoned, used, or betrayed. Horus Rising, the War Master's Fall. The salt in those wounds worked fastest on the one who had the least reason to turn. The Emperor's favorite son, his first found Primarch, his chosen War Master. Horus Lupercal stood above all others as an exemplar of what the Space Marines could be. Yet, one ritual on a backwater moon transformed this paragon into the Imperium's greatest nightmare. The most devastating betrayal in human history didn't start with hatred, it started with a vision. Imagine being the golden child who suddenly feels abandoned. That's exactly what happened when the Emperor retreated from the Great Crusade to work on his mysterious projects back on Terra. Horus, who had been at his father's side since the beginning, was left holding the reins of an empire with no explanation. The silence crushed him more than the burden of command. Why would the Emperor suddenly withdraw without explaining his plans to his most trusted son? This creeping sense of abandonment created the perfect crack for chaos to exploit. Like water seeping into concrete before a freeze, what happened on Davin's moon would shatter everything. Horus suffered a grave wound in battle, one that Imperial medicine should have easily treated. Instead, cultists convinced his officers to submit him to a healing ritual that opened a direct channel to the Chaos Gods. While Horus lay in fever dreams, the Dark God showed him visions of a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god. For a Primarch raised on Imperial truth, which rejected religious worship, this revelation felt like a knife in the heart. The Emperor had condemned Lorgar for the very thing he would eventually become. The hypocrisy was unbearable. When Horus emerged, he appeared healed, perhaps even more charismatic than before. But inside, rebellion had taken root. He who had once lived to serve his father now plotted his downfall. His Luna Wolves, already honored by becoming the Sons of Horus after his elevation to War Master, represented a distinction no other legion received. With up to 170,000 Astartes at his command, they weren't just numerous, they were led by the most brilliant strategic mind among the Primarchs, a mind now bent towards rebellion. Horus knew he couldn't challenge the Emperor alone. Here, his genius truly emerged. He approached each brother as a master psychologist, identifying their deepest wounds and offering exactly what the Emperor had denied them. To Perturbo, recognition. To Angron, freedom from the nails. To Mortarion, an end to psychic powers. To Alfarius, salvation from a darker future. Each pitch was tailored because each brother's pain was unique. While the Emperor treated his sons as weapons, Horus recognized them as individuals. The cruel irony, Horus understood his brother's humanity better than the Emperor ever did. When he spoke, you believed him. Not through manipulation, but through genuine understanding. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't need to lie. He simply offered alternatives to brothers who felt they had none. Before corruption, Horus admired the Emperor completely. His fall wasn't a villain revealing true colors, it was a hero broken and rebuilt. He saw not just hypocrisy, but his own obsolescence in a future where Primarchs were no longer needed. Magnus the Red, Tragedy of Good Intentions. If tragedy is measured by the gap between intention and consequence, then no tale in the Heresy is more tragic than that of Magnus the Red. While Horus fell to corruption, Magnus fell to something far more insidious: his own loyalty. Magnus's story begins with a terrible irony. Across the war, this crimson giant with extraordinary psychic abilities witnessed a horrifying vision. His brother Horus corrupted and planning to betray their father. Imagine discovering the most terrible secret in the galaxy, one that could destroy everything your father built. What would you do? Magnus made what seemed like the only logical choice: warn the Emperor immediately. But here's where things went catastrophically wrong. Magnus, desperate to deliver his message quickly, violated the Emperor's direct orders from the Council of Nicaea. Remember when the Emperor restricted the use of psychic powers? Magnus channeled such immense psychic energy that he physically tore through the Emperor's protective wards around Terra, like a modern whistleblower breaking through firewalls only to trigger the system's own self-destruct sequence. Magnus broke down the psychic equivalent of humanity's most fortified bunker. Behind those defenses lay the Emperor's most secret project, the Imperial Webway, a network of dimensional corridors allowing instant travel across the galaxy without dangerous warp navigation. In his desperate bid to warn, Magnus inadvertently unraveled secrets too dangerous to bear, destroying years of the Emperor's work in an instant. The Emperor's reaction was explosive. Furious, he dispatched Leman Russ and his Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra for punishment. The tragedy deepened when Horus, already corrupted, secretly modified the Emperor's orders. Instead of capturing Magnus, the new orders called for the complete destruction of Magnus and his legion. What followed was devastation incarnate. The Space Wolves descended upon Prospero, the beautiful homeworld of the Thousand Suns. A planet of scholars and libraries burned to ash. When the attack began, 62,000 Thousand Suns stood ready to defend their home, lives snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. By the time the fires died down, barely 1,242 remained, each survivor carrying the weight of countless dead brothers. Can you imagine watching everything you built burn to ash because you tried to do the right thing? Magnus, broken in body and spirit, made a fateful choice in that moment of desperation. He turned to the chaos god Tzeentch for salvation. It wasn't ambition that drove Magnus to chaos, it was a desperate need to save what remained of his legion. The Thousand Suns, once proud scholars and psychically gifted warriors, were transformed into sorcerers bound to Tzeentch, their abilities now their eternal curse. The knowledge that doomed Magnus was about more than Horus. In his psychic journeys, Magnus had glimpsed the true nature of the warp and discovered the Emperor's Webway project, secrets the Emperor kept hidden even from his sons. The Emperor's obsession with controlling information created the very vulnerability that allowed tragedy to unfold. Angron and the World Eaters, Rage Incarnate. The Emperor may have abandoned Magnus, but his treatment of Angron created something far worse than a traitor. He created a monster with nothing left to lose. While Magnus fell through knowledge, Angron fell through anguish and rage, hardwired directly into his brain. Imagine fighting a desperate rebellion against your slavers on Nuceria, leading your fellow gladiators, the only family you've ever known, in a last stand for freedom. You're ready to die together when suddenly a golden figure appears and forcibly teleports you away, forcing you to watch helplessly as your brothers and sisters are slaughtered. This trauma became the foundation of Angron's hatred. The Emperor's rescue of Angron ranks as the single most disastrous misjudgment in his long history of poor parenting decisions. Instead of helping a legion of proud warriors, he gifted them a broken Primarch consumed by grief and betrayal. The once disciplined warhounds transformed into the vicious World Eaters under Angron's leadership, but worse horrors awaited. Angron had the Butcher's nails embedded in his skull, neural implants that made fighting feel incredible while deadening every other emotion. In his most self-destructive act, Angron demanded his legion undergo the same procedure. Picture it, 150,000 superhuman warriors with their brains rewired to experience nothing but murderous rage. These implants weren't mere enhancements, they were ticking time bombs lodged in every soldier's skull. The nails were incompatible with Astartes physiology. They interacted catastrophically with enhanced bodies, making the World Eaters increasingly unstable with each passing year. Their combat doctrine transformed. Battle plans gave way to berserker charges. Strategy dissolved into slaughter. Discipline crumbled before bloodlust. Every World Eater knew the nails would kill them eventually. The implants eroded their brains, consuming centers for reason and empathy first. All that remained was a raw pleasure of violence. Even in lucidity, there was no return. Battle provided the only respite where pain briefly subsided. At Isstvan III, their self-destruction reached horrific heights. When Loyalist World Eaters realized their brothers' betrayal, the conflict became savage beyond comprehension. 35,000 died fighting each other. Brothers slaughtered brother in a frenzy that demonstrated just how far they'd fallen from the Emperor's vision. The World Eaters' fall stands uniquely tragic because it wasn't driven by ideology. They didn't choose chaos. Their neurology predetermined it. The Butcher's nails had already remade them into perfect vessels for Khorne, the blood god, long before formal allegiance. When they embraced Khorne, it wasn't corruption, but culmination, finding a patron who valued the only thing they could still feel. Their transformation into Khorne berserkers revealed what they'd already become. The World Eaters weren't seduced by chaos like other legions. They were driven to it by physiology and despair. Their corruption began the moment the Emperor abandoned Angron's brothers to die on Nuceria. Could there have been any other path? Had the Emperor rescued Angron's fellow gladiators, had he healed rather than exploited Angron's trauma, perhaps one of his most powerful sons might have remained loyal even in humanity's darkest hour. Lorgar and the Word-Bearers, first to fall. If the World Eaters fell through physical corruption, the Word-Bearers fell through spiritual devastation. Think about it. What kind of twisted irony is it when the most loyal, the most devout of the Emperor's sons becomes the very first to turn traitor? The greatest zealot of the Imperium became the architect of humanity's near downfall. Lorgar's journey began on Colchis, a world steeped in religious tradition where he was raised to see divinity in power. When the Emperor arrived in his golden splendor, Lorgar saw what he believed was obvious: a god in human form. Unlike Angron's trauma or Magnus's psychic gifts, Lorgar's defining trait was absolute, unwavering faith. While other Primarchs conquered worlds through brute force or tactical brilliance, Lorgar meticulously converted entire populations to worship the Emperor. His conquests were spiritual transformations. Each world the Word-bearers brought into compliance joined the Imperium as true believers in the imperial cult Lorgar was creating. The Emperor wanted none of it. Imagine spending decades crafting beautiful cities with golden temples and converting billions to worship your father, only for him to show up one day and basically say, "This is embarrassing, stop it." At Monarchia, the Emperor made his point in the most devastating way possible. The humiliation cut deeper than mere disappointment. Amid the acrid smoke of burning temples and the crackle of collapsing golden statues, the Emperor forced the entire Word-bearers Legion to kneel in the ashes. 100,000 Space Marines on their knees, choking on the dust of their shattered faith, while Malkador lectured them like disobedient children. Like a fallen angel cast from heaven, Lorgar's soul burned hotter than the city around him. This spiritual execution transformed Lorgar from devoted son to cosmic heretic. In the aftermath, he did what any devastated believer might do when their god rejects them. He looked for new ones. His pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror was a genuine spiritual journey seeking gods who would accept the devotion the Emperor had spurned. And unfortunately for the galaxy, he found them. The Word-bearers transformed from the Emperor's most zealous followers to his most methodical enemies. What makes them uniquely dangerous is that they calculated their betrayal over decades. While other legions were still loyally fighting the Great Crusade, the Word-bearers were already planting cult cells on hundreds of worlds. Their role in corrupting other legions was unparalleled. They understood faith and manipulation better than any, exploiting the doubts of their brother legions. At the drop site massacre on Isstvan V, their duplicity resulted in the near destruction of 3 loyal legions, testament to their complete transformation. The question that haunts the Imperium, if the Emperor had simply accepted Lorgar's worship, could the heresy have been avoided? If the Master of Mankind had allowed himself to be venerated as Lorgar wished, would half his legions still stand loyal today? We'll never know, but the tragic irony remains. In rejecting worship, the Emperor guaranteed he would eventually receive it from a broken Imperium he could no longer protect. Legacy of the Legions, Aftermath, and Rebirth. After the dust settled on the greatest betrayal in human history, Guilliman faced a terrifying truth. Guilliman faced a terrifying truth no one wanted to admit. The Legion system itself was fundamentally flawed. What's the first thing you do when your unstoppable army proves too dangerous to exist in its current form, but too necessary to disband completely? You break it into smaller, more manageable pieces. Imagine the devastation following the Heresy. The Emperor confined to the Golden Throne, Terra in ruins, and half the Imperium's greatest warriors had just tried to burn everything to the ground. The Imperium needed a solution, and fast. Robert Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, looked at the smoking ruins of humanity's dream and did what he did best. He made a plan. The Codex Astartes was Guilliman's answer to prevent another Horus from ever rising again. His solution was radical but elegant. No single commander should ever control more than 1,000 Space Marines. This was essentially the galaxy's biggest corporate restructuring, taking massive legions of hundreds of thousands and breaking them into autonomous divisions with their own leadership. The focus was accountability. A fallen chapter meant losing 1,000 Marines instead of 100,000. This reorganization, the second founding, transformed both the structure and psyche of the Emperor's forces. Each original legion became the parent chapter, maintaining its name and traditions while spawning numerous successors. These new chapters received portions of their legion's gene seed, but developed unique identities over time. The psychological impact was profound. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists initially refused to split, seeing it as punishment for loyalty. "Thanks for not betraying the Emperor, now surrender your legion." Eventually, even stubborn Dorn relented. Many chapters found creative workarounds. The Dark Angels and their unforgiven successors operate as separate chapters publicly, but function almost as a legion behind closed doors, united by their hunt for the Fallen. The Inner Circle connects these supposedly independent chapters into a coordinated network. While the Loyalists reorganize with Guilliman's pragmatic precision, the traitors face their own chaotic restructuring. Fleeing into the Eye of Terror after their defeat at Terra, most traitor legions fractured into competing warbands over 10 millennia of hatred and betrayal. Some, like the Word Bearers, maintained more cohesion than others, but even they lost the unified structure of their former glory. These Chaos warbands still emerge periodically to terrorize the Imperium, each carrying the twisted legacy of the parent legion, corrupted by their time in the warp. The chapter system has prevented any heresy-scale rebellion for 10,000 years, an impressive security record, but at considerable cost. When facing massive threats like the Hive Fleet Leviathan, coordinating independent chapters proves challenging. The Imperium traded raw power for stability, gaining security but losing the overwhelming force that once conquered the galaxy. The introduction of Primaris Space Marines represents the culmination of these lessons. Created by Basilaris Call under Guilliman's direction, these enhanced Astartes have greater stability and resistance to corruption. The Emperor's second attempt at perfect warriors, but with safeguards against the flaws that doomed the original legions. The Lost and the Damned, the Unknown Legions. For all the Emperor's grand designs and lofty ambition, there's something particularly chilling about the blank spaces in Imperial history. 20 Primarchs were created, but only 18 made it into the history books. The other 2? Wiped from history, their very names forbidden to be spoken. The Emperor erased these sons from existence, and when a being with the power to shape worlds decides something needs to be forgotten, you've got to wonder what was so terrible even the master of mankind couldn't let it be remembered. The mystery of the 2nd and 11th Legions represents perhaps the most tantalizing enigma in the entire Imperium. These were full legions with Primarchs, battle honors, and thousands of transhuman warriors who vanished from history. The Imperial archives contain nothing about them, with their names redacted from every historical document. What could prompt such extreme measures? What transgression warranted complete obliteration from memory? The surviving Primarchs swore an oath never to discuss their missing brothers. Think about that for a second. These beings, engineered for conquest, rarely known for emotional restraint, maintained absolute silence. Lorgar is said to have mourned their loss profoundly, suggesting these events left lasting emotional scars on the Emperor's remaining sons. One curious detail provides a potential clue. The Ultramarines were unusually large compared to the other legions, which may attribute to absorbing warriors from at least one of the lost legions. If true, this suggests that while the Primarchs themselves might have been beyond redemption, their gene sons weren't necessarily corrupted beyond salvation. Are the Ultramarines carrying the genetic legacy of a brother legion whose name they can never acknowledge? Several sources hint that the Space Wolves may have been involved, fulfilling their role as the Emperor's executioners. Before turning their fangs against Magnus and the Thousand Sons, were they unleashed against their own brothers? Imagine legions designed to fight humanity's enemies instead of exterminating their own. The grim irony that defines the 40k universe. What crime could warrant such complete erasure? Perhaps their gene seed contained catastrophic flaws threatening the entire Space Marine project. Maybe they stumbled upon forbidden knowledge. or they committed atrocities so shocking that even in a galaxy where billions die daily, they cross some invisible line. In the Imperium's brutal calculus, existence isn't a right. It's conditional on usefulness. The Emperor's willingness to erase two of his own creations reveals much about his character. This was a cold pragmatist protecting his grand design at any cost. The lost legions weren't worth preserving even as cautionary tales. The Emperor decided it was better for humanity to forget they ever existed than to learn from their example. These empty spaces in Imperial history tell us more about the Emperor than pages of documentation ever could. He created 20 superhuman sons, but viewed them ultimately as tools, not children. When two proved effective or dangerous, he discarded them completely. Is it any wonder that half the remaining Primarchs eventually rebelled? The seeds of the heresy might have been sown with whatever fate befell these forgotten brothers. And here we are at the end of our odyssey through the legions. The Emperor's grand experiment in genetic engineering echoes through the galaxy 10 millennia after Horus's betrayal. These ancient grudges still shape the Imperium as loyal chapters battle their fallen brothers across the stars. The warriors created to unify humanity became instruments of its near destruction. The heresy wasn't just a betrayal. It was a family tragedy where superhuman sons inherited all too human flaws from their creator. The Emperor crafted beings simultaneously too powerful to control, yet too emotional to be the cold weapons he intended. The galaxy never recovered from that civil war. What remains of the Emperor's dream when brother still fights brother, the ancient oaths defining the 41st millennium? In the grim darkness of the far future, the wounds of that first betrayal never heal.